Well, good morning again. I'm Ron Holdaway, License Unity teacher here at Unity Spiritual Center of Panama City. I'm not sure I introduced myself at the very beginning, so I'm a little off my game today. So we'll get back on it. So here, I'm going to read something from Genesis to start this, which might be a clue with this photograph on the slides. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the water, upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved into the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So most of us come from a Christian background. Most of us have heard these words over and over and over. Even in our secular society, we hear that pretty often. But this slide that's on the screen is on December the 24th, 1968, the Apollo 8 mission, the NASA Apollo 8 mission, completed the first manned orbit of the moon, 1968, which December 24th, Christmas Eve, 50 years ago. So I was 16 years old, and I remember it. I remember watching it, and it was, a marvelous technical feat. To think that those guys did what they did without computers, or barely a computer, what we wouldn't even consider a computer today. Most of it was with slide rules and the calculations. So it's absolutely, the rocket should have blown up. They should not have made it back. On and on and on. There's all kinds. So, but the big thing is that 50 years ago, our relationship to the Earth and our position in the universe changed forever. This photograph, called Earthrise, was the beginning of what we know, how small the planet Earth is in the universe. For generations, humankind has thought that everything revolved around the Earth, that the Earth was the center of the universe. Well, we knew it before this, but this was documentation. We'd never seen anything like this. So the other thing that was miraculous about this mission was that Apollo 8 went to the dark side of the moon. So they were without communications to NASA for every time they did the orbit for over 22 minutes, and so never knew whether they were going to come back out. But as they completed the orbit and came back, the photographs like this and the surface of the moon started to be sent back to NASA, and it was just an amazing feat. So during the last 10 orbits, they made 10 orbits around the moon, and during the last 10 orbits, Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders took turns reading from the first 10 verses from the book of Genesis, the creation story. That's what came to their minds, I guess. So Anders he took more pictures of the Earth than he did for the surface of the moon, which is what was really the objective of the mission. He wound up being so enthralled with that because mankind had never seen this before. So over the millennia, scientific research and discovery, such as the Apollo 8 mission, have caused all of us, humankind, to reconsider our existence in the universe. In 1989, which was the founding of Unity, when Charles and Merle founded it, Charles Fillmore wrote that bridging science and religion would be a central purpose in the Unity movement. So even as far back in the 19th century, in 1889, Charles Fillmore was legendary for his scientific interest in scientific discovery. Both Charles and Myrtle, it was reported in some of the writings that they were so interested about science, and then saw the scientific discoveries as sources of new insights for interpreting Scripture, unlike the very conservative interpretation of the time. And even today, they were even then they were open to the new, what we learned from scientific discovery, and about reinterpreting the Scriptures. So for me personally, I believe that what I've learned now in lots of study in my adult life is that religions must embrace and acknowledge the facts produced from scientific discoveries in order to stay relevant in this technological age. The subtitle for my talk is the need for a science-conscious religion. I didn't create that. There's several other large Christian movements that are calling for that, a science-conscious religion. And obviously fact and faith have been in competition, if you will, for years, and probably will always continue to be. And there needs to be a movement toward being conscious of these scientific discoveries. Charles Fillmore agreed with this, and many of his writings includes thoughts about scientific discovery of his day. He invited and welcomed better understanding of the universe. So he was really ahead of his time, if you will. A core belief in unity is embracing critical thinking, which calls for evaluation of evidence and reflection on the underlying meaning of observations and experience. This continues the tradition even as far back as Socrates, who's the founder of philosophy, which encouraged critical thinking. So can't come to us. Our whole knowledge about critical thinking comes from the Greeks, even as far back as Socrates. And then Sir Francis Bacon is considered the inventor of modern scientific method. He promoted the use of logic to test propositions and empirical observation. So when we talk about science, and this has been a big hang-up in this whole genre about religion versus science, science is a process. It's not a collection of facts or theories. Scientific methods are the way we get to those facts and theories, point us in the right direction. But again, science is not the facts, it's the process to get to them. So in 1609, Galileo became the first human to study the sky and the stars through a telescope. Today we marvel that we live in a galaxy with billions and billions of stars. The estimate is somewhere between 200 and 400 billion stars and 100 billion planets. And the galaxy, the Milky Way, the galaxy that we're in, is 52,000 light years in diameter, basically. And then the other scientific thing that has always been a trouble between religion and the scientific community is evolution. Darwinism is 150 years old, and it was developed by the English naturalist Charles Darwin and others, stating that all species of organisms arrive and develop through the natural selection of small inherited variations that increase the individual's ability to compete, survive, and reproduce. I don't have a slide of it, but I've seen images of embryos from all kinds of animals, various animals, and for the first several months, several weeks of gestation, the embryos all look the same. We all come from a common genetic code. Research into evolution is the cornerstone of modern biology, but it has been difficult for persons of faith to accept it. We no longer need theological explanations for the universe, or snowflakes for that matter, or any living organisms. The laws of nature are such that matter and energy can organize themselves into complex forms, and the systems which surround us. Given the laws of physics, all known physical systems can be explained as the product of ordinary physical processes. As a matter of fact, Charles Fillmore, I'll state that again in a minute, embraced evolution. He embraced the theory of evolution, which is, again, also seems to be a contradiction from a religious mystic, if you will. Charles Fillmore, as a mystic, would embrace a concept like evolution. So the creation story that I read in the opening, and by the way, there are two, if you haven't read that in a while, and We're going to go into that a little in a more detail starting in March. We've got a series of talks that we're going to do that you'll find very interesting. You'll learn some about that. But there's two creation stories in the Bible, and guess what? They conflict with each other. There's some conflict. So the creation stories, but they've been used by creationists. And by the way, there's a difference between creation, the creation stories or the creation concept, and creationists. Creationists have an agenda. Usually it's a fundamentalist approach to a literal interpretation of the Bible. And the creationists have used the Bible to prove that the earth is around 6,000 years old and that man walked with the dinosaurs and that God created the universe in literally 6 days. The 6,000-year-old age was arrived by James Ussher, a 17th century Irish archbishop, who counted the estimates of the ages of Abraham's family listed in the Old Testament and calculated that the creation began on the Julian calendar on Saturday, which I don't think they knew about 6,000 years ago, October the 22nd, 4004 BC, at 6 p.m. That's what he wrote, that's what he said. We know now that the earth is 4.5, scientifically evidenced, a number of studies have proven this, that the earth is 4.5 billion years old, plus or minus 10%, the scientists say. A number of scientific methods have proven this. Yet, from fossils to the Grand Canyon, the sediment layers in the Grand Canyon have been a big help in identifying the planet's age. Yet there are some who continue to use the Bible literally to refute scientific reality. Based on the earliest fossils that we know today, humans like us, similar to us, appeared on the planet 200,000 years ago. Not 6,000 or whatever the creationists say. Again, fossil evidence has proven this. So there's a creation museum in Kentucky. It's a Christian evangelical outreach of answers in Genesis. The Ark, there's an Ark there. Noah's Ark theme park is what it's called. A few miles from the Creation Museum. It's 550 feet long. They built it to replicate the description in the Bible of the Ark. And again, it's an evangelical outreach to justify. The quote from the website says, "Why God's infallible word, rather than man's faulty assumptions, is the place to begin if we want to make sense of our world." So we're still in this mode, and particularly in the U.S., particularly in Western Christianity, with this science versus religion. So when I started preparing this, I realized that this is a huge undertaking. I've read about this for so many years. What got me into unity was questioning the stories, the Bible stories I'd been told in my youth. A lot of them didn't make sense. We could go into a lot of details, even including some of the miracles, some of the aspects of Jesus attributed in the Gospels to Jesus' life. Some of those we need to look at, and most of you know that we look at the resurrection, the virgin birth. We look at those metaphysically for what it means to each one of us. So why does this matter? Why are we even talking about it? Why can't we just let people, do what they want to do? If you want to believe this, you can believe that. If you want to believe this, if you want to believe the facts, you can, or you can stay in your beliefs. And so why must there be agreement? For too many people, religion is the primary, and this sounds like a judgment. It's not meant to be, but it's the matter of fact. I was reading an article by Deepak Chopra when I heard this, that he says that religion is too often the only form of spirituality a lot of people have. There's no reflection. There's just a religion. Many years ago, I had an Episcopal priest. I was in counseling with an Episcopal many years ago. And he asked me, and I grew up in church my whole life, and he asked me, what's the difference? He said, Ron, what's the difference between religion and spirituality? I didn't have a clue. I thought it was the same. I didn't. Well, as a matter of fact, being in church my whole life, I don't remember as a young kid, boy coming up, young adult, remember anything about spirituality or it even being mentioned. So I told him, I don't have a clue. That was my answer. I remember it to this day. And he told me, here's what he said to me. He said, religion is man's attempt to incorporate God, to put God in a box, if you will. To incorporate means to, if you will, establish all the dogmas and creeds and, try to find God for all of us rather than each one of us being on that path for ourselves. So again, a core belief in unity is embracing critical thinking, which calls for evaluation of evidence and reflection on the underlying meaning of observations and experiences. So all of these technological advances are an opportunity for us to look at what's going on rather than to discount them. So again, why do we do this? Well, controversy in the Christian church, particularly here, is seldom just about theological formations or studying of the Scripture. Very seldom, because many people know today that their religious convictions cannot stand public scrutiny because the facts are the facts. So the fights and divisions tend to focus within the church on issues such as racial prejudice, equality for women or members of the LGBT communities, or human sexuality issues such as birth control, abortion, etc., etc. Sacred texts of all the world's religions have been used to instill fear and control people. So that's why we, in my opinion, have the need for a science-conscious religion. So Einstein said, science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. So there's a lot of quotes from Einstein. He wasn't affiliated with any religion, but he talks a lot about God. In his, I've got a book that's full of Einstein quotes and what he was doing when he came up with these. I've got a few of them here. He says, a table, a chair, a bowl of fruit, and a violin. What else does a man need to be happy? And there are only two ways to live your life. One is through nothing is a miracle. The other is everything is a miracle. Weak people revenge. Strong people forgive. Intelligent people ignore. What is right is not always popular, and what is popular is not always already right. So this made me think about the whole issue of climate change, and don't know where you are, but there's been 1.5 billion, that's billion measurements of the Earth temperature since 1880. And the temperature of the planet is rising since then, so I don't know how many more measurements we need to take. 1.5 billion. Climate change is not really complicated. The temperature is rising. So another quote from Einstein is, common sense is the collection of prejudices acquired by the age of 18. And this is one that I've heard many years ago that I really like. It'll take some explanation sometime I could do offline. He said there must be a God because ice floats on water. So from a scientific standpoint, that's what that means, is that it changes phase from a liquid to a solid and floats within itself as a different phase. So there's, from what I remember, there's no other substance on the planet that does that. So Einstein said there must be a God, because it defies a little bit about, increase the density of that material and then it still floats in itself. So you might know this, but Einstein was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1921, but history would soon intervene. The Nazis were on the rise in his native Germany. He was Jewish born, and he was targeted for assassination. In 1933, he and his family moved to Princeton, and he spent the rest of his days in Princeton doing his work. He became a very strong figure and activist for the fight to curtail the use of the atomic bomb, which, in essence, he helped create, or at least the background for it. and was a very strong voice against racism and nationalism. So Richard Rohr, who is one of the guys I read a lot and look to a lot, he's a Franciscan priest and author. Matter of fact, he's at Reverend Joe and Rob moved to Albuquerque. He has a center for contemplation in Albuquerque, and I'm going there in March for a conference there. So I read him a lot. So here's what he said. This might sound a little harsh, but I'll clarify what he's getting to in a minute. For all its inspiration, for all the lives it has changed, the Bible is undeniably problematic. Put in the hands of egocentric, unloving, or power-hungry people, or those who have never learned how to read spiritually inspired literature, it is almost always a disaster. History has demonstrated this century after century, so this is not an unwarranted, disrespectful, or biased conclusion. Again, this is from a Franciscan monk, priest. The burning of heretics, the crusades, slavery, apartheid, homophobia, and the genocide oppression of native peoples were all justified through the selective use of scriptural quotes. But yet we know in unity, so he goes on to say, and I'll put this in my own words, because he's not the only one that says this. There's a lot of progressive Christians, I guess, today that say, but we don't, in unity, we know there's much that the biblical scripture can teach us if we look at it the way it was intended. It wasn't intended to be a club to use to control people. We don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The Bible describes through history, again, this is one of the teachings that Charles Fillmore talks about in several of his books, the Jewish people and the life of Jesus for us, the birth, death, and resurrection of each of our, each soul. It's the birth, death, and resurrection of each of our souls. We don't need to change the scriptural text, but we need to read it as it was intended by the Jewish authors. And the perennial wisdom means this is wisdom that comes up in all the ancient scriptures and text that it enforces. So Unity's founders, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, taught that each of us, as we explore the divine presence within us, becomes a participant in the process of continuous creation. And again, Charles Fillmore accepted the evidence for biological evolution. He wrote, "Evolution is the unfolding in consciousness of that which God involved in man in the beginning." So he embraced it. It's part of the plan. Just like snowflakes, no two people worship and love God in the same way. It is not important how we love, but that we do it. So we live in a time of unprecedented scientific exploration. There's a question I've heard posed is what happens when complexity races ahead of the brain's ability to understand it? What happens when complexity races ahead of the brain's ability to understand it? If you're like me, we're into that point in a lot of ways. If you get in your car, you're having to put in your CD or put your iPhone up, and then you're trying to set your GPS and do all that at the same time. The technology is getting almost, and the social media has almost got ahead of our brain. Is ahead of our brains. Right now, while we've been talking, there's probably 10 new apps you could download on your iPhone. I don't want any more apps. There's enough. And then 5G is right around the corner. If you've heard about that, that's going to make AI, artificial intelligence, pervasive, ubiquitous to our society. It's coming. So to catch up, we're all going to have to turn into androids, it looks like. So each new discovery promises new insights into the understanding of the universe and the conscious mind within our own being. In Unity, we celebrate these discoveries just as we celebrate each new discovery and insight in our own spiritual journeys. So rather than, here's an example of something brand new that's just happened this year, January the 22nd, the The ultimate Thule is a photograph taken by a deep space exploration. First time ever to see this. It's 9 billion miles away from the sun. It's an exploration to know, to study, and to know more about the creation of the formation of the universe. So again, scientific discovery is real, and it gives us a chance to apply it and use it in our own spiritual journey. Namaste.